In this lesson, we're moving on to our last topic in formation of the traditional enforceable contract, which is the statute of frauds. But before we jump into the statute of frauds, as a quick refresher, how do we go about forming a traditional enforceable contract? Remember, we have three elements. We need mutual assent between the parties, consideration, and no defenses to formation that would invalidate the otherwise valid contract. In case you're wondering where we are in the big picture flow of our contracts analysis, we're still on formation of the traditional enforceable contract, but we're moving on to our last topic, right? We're moving on from defenses to the S in my cats do sneak. Of course, this S stands for the statute of frauds. So at this point, we know how a traditional enforceable contract is formed, right? We know mutual assent, offer, and acceptance supported by consideration. And if there's no defenses to formation that would invalidate it, then we have a traditional enforceable contract, unless, right, we have one more hurdle we have to think about. And this is our final hurdle when we're thinking about formation of the traditional enforceable contract, and that is the statute of frauds, right? Which you should think about as merely an evidentiary requirement that some types of contracts have to satisfy in order to be enforceable, right? We have the statute of frauds to prevent fraud, to prevent people from coming to court and making up stuff that never existed. Now, it's very important to remember, right, from the very first video, I said that our general starting point rule is that we don't have any formality requirements needed to form a traditional enforceable contract. All we need is mutual assent, consideration, and no defenses to formation that would invalidate the contract. And remember, the example I used was, I offer to sell you this dry erase marker for $5, and you say, I accept. And we said that that was a contract. We didn't need any writing requirement. We didn't need any evidence to show that that contract existed, right? We had mutual assent and consideration, assuming there's no defenses to formation. That was a traditional enforceable oral contract, and that was completely acceptable. The reason, though, that that is acceptable as an oral contract is because it does not trigger the statute of frauds, right? Now, certain types of contracts will trigger the statute of frauds. If the contract falls under any of these categories on the board right here, right, it's going to trigger the statute of frauds. And at that point, the court's going to say, okay, if you have a contract that triggers one of these categories, right, or a contract that falls under one of these categories, that's going to trigger the statute of frauds. And now we need to see evidence that this contract existed in order to enforce it, right? And again, this is to prevent fraud, because imagine the following scenario. Let's say that you finish watching all of these videos, right? You dominate law school, you dominate the bar exam, you go out, you become a big shot attorney, and you start making tons of money, right? What do? You go buy a multi-million-dollar home. And I learn about this, and I want your home, but I can't afford a multi-million-dollar home, so I want to get it at a deal. So I concoct a scheme, right? Let's say that I know a little thing or two about contract law, and I know, right, all I need to show the court is that we have mutual assent, consideration, and no defenses to formation. I can come to court and say, look, we had an oral contract. We had an oral mutual assent, right? Oral offer and acceptance and oral consideration. And there's no defenses here. So we have to enforce this agreement. So I can walk into court and say, hey, look, me and so-and-so offered, so-and-so offered to sell me his multi-million-dollar mansion for $100,000, and I accepted, right? We had mutual assent. The $100,000 is consideration. There's no defenses here that would invalidate the contract. This is a completely legit contract. And the court's going to say, that's fine, Michael. If you guys had a contract for $100,000, we'll enforce it. But because that contract triggers the statute of frauds, we need to see evidence that it existed, right? You have to provide us some sort of evidence that this contract existed. If you can do that, and you have mutual assent, consideration, and no defenses that invalidate it, we will enforce your contract. Right now, generally, to satisfy the statute of frauds, to provide the evidence that they need, what is that usually going to look like? we're going to say it's a writing signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought, which would be you in this case, right? I would need to provide a contract that you have signed agreeing to these terms, right? Now, if I don't have a signed writing, there are some ways by performance I may also be able to show sufficient evidence that the contract existed, but we'll talk about that in a minute, right? The first thing we want to talk about is what exactly triggers the statute of frauds. And this is very important to recognize because one of the mistakes that I see students make is they apply the statute of frauds to every type of contract that they see. They see a contract, they want to apply the statute of frauds to it. And that's why I opened with, remember, our very first video. I offered to sell you this dry erase marker for $5 and you say, I accept. We don't care about the statute of frauds, right? It's not an issue. It's not triggered. That contract does not fall under any of these categories. So the court doesn't need to see any evidence it existed to enforce it. The statute of frauds is out of the analysis, right? All we care about there is mutual assent, consideration, and defenses. If we have mutual assent supported by consideration and no defenses, the court's going to enforce that contract irrespective of whether or not I have evidence the contract existed, because the statute of frauds is not triggered for the purchase and sale of a $5 dry erase marker. That does not fall under any of these categories, right? So let's talk about the categories that do trigger the statute of frauds, where the court is now going to say, okay, to enforce this, we have to see evidence that it existed, which is usually a signed writing, right? So the categories for our purposes on law school and the bar exam are going to be strictly limited to what you see here on the board. And we have an acronym, right? Sticking to our contract law CAT theme, we have M.O.U.S.E.R, right? M.O.U.S.E.R. And this is going to stand for marriage, the 1-year provision, UCC Goods contracts for $500 or more, Suretyship contracts, Executor, Administrator of an estate contracts, and real estate contracts, right? So we'll talk about all of these in a lot of detail, how it plays out, but the key to remember here is if we have a contract that falls under one of these categories, that triggers the statute of frauds. That contract cannot be enforced unless the court sees evidence that the contract existed, right? But again, remember, only limited to these categories. $5 purchase and sale for a dry erase marker, we don't care about the statute of frauds, right? It's out. It's not in our analysis. Right, but let's just start jumping into these. So the first one we have where we're going to say, okay, we have to see evidence that this contract existed. What we call triggering the statute of frauds is contracts that are made in consideration of marriage, right? And the key with marriage contracts to realize when we're thinking about the statute of frauds is this does not include the promise between two people to marry each other. We're only talking about contracts that are made in consideration of marriage, which would typically include premarital agreements, right? Prenups would be the main thing we're thinking here. But this would also include any contract made in consideration of marriage. So imagine that a father of the bride promises his future son-in-law that if he marries his daughter, right, in consideration of marriage, if you marry my daughter, I promise to buy the two of you a home to live in a week after you marry, right? That is a contract made in consideration of marriage, right? A little bit unusual, but would trigger the statute of frauds if you saw that. Any contract made in consideration of marriage. Now, again, the more classic example is the prenup, a premarital agreement. The main thing, though, to recognize here is that a promise between two people, the marriage contract itself, does not trigger the statute of frauds. We're only talking about contracts made in consideration of marriage, right? The next type of contract, the next category we want to think about, if the contract falls under this category, it triggers the statute of frauds, and the court needs to see evidence that the contract existed in order to enforce it, is any contract that by its terms cannot be performed in less than a year from the time that the contract is formed, right? So what we have here on the board is a simple timeline. And imagine on this timeline that this first tick you see, right? That is the date that the contract is formed. That is formation, right? The day that the parties execute the contract. Now, To be very technical, most courts are going to say that it's actually the day after the contract is made, but the time of formation is what we're looking at. The important thing to recognize that this first tick is either the time of formation or the day after the contract is formed, right? And then what we have here is this red dashed line that represents 365 days, right? And what we're saying is if the contract can be performed, if it's legally capable of being performed without a breach at any time in this red dashed line before 1 year, then the statute of frauds is not triggered, right? That contract is capable of being performed in less than a year, then it is not going to trigger the statute of frauds, okay? So the easy trick here is basically if the contract does not have a time requirement in it, it's probably not going to trigger the statute of frauds, and we'll talk about why that is. Okay, so imagine that the classic is a 13-month lease, right? It is impossible to perform a 13-month lease by its terms in less than 1 year. You cannot do it, right? You cannot perform a 13-month lease in less than 365 days. That contract will 100 out of 100 times trigger the statute of frauds, right? Now, unless you have some sort of option in there to terminate early, either party can terminate that contract early, right? So not 100 out of 100, but again, the question is it capable of being performed in less than 365 days, right? In a 13-month lease, generally cannot be performed in less than 365 days unless you have some sort of termination clause where either party, whatever, can terminate the contract at any time. Obviously, then that could be performed in less than 365 days, right? So you want to ask the question, is it capable of being performed in less than 1 year from the date the contract is made? So one place I see students get tripped up here is say you have an 8-month lease, right? Well, some students think, oh, 8 months, that's less than a year. So that does not trigger the statute of frauds. But that's not the question. The length of performance doesn't matter. It's from the date the contract is made. So if you have an 8-month lease that starts on the date that the contract is formed, then yes, that does not trigger the statute of frauds. But if it starts 6 months later from the date that the contract is formed, so the contract is formed and the 8-month lease starts 6 months later from the date of formation, then that contract is impossible to perform in less than 365 days from the date of formation, right? So just because you see an 8-month lease or a 6-month lease, don't automatically assume that that does not trigger the statute of frauds, right? It could. It depends on the date that the contract was formed and the date that the performance starts, right? And our measurement is from the time, when we're thinking about the statute of frauds, from the time of formation, not the time of performance, right? So that's one thing you want to look out for, tricky wise on the 1 year provision. The other would be the idea, another classic trick fact pattern with the 1 year provision would be anytime you see a promise to do something for the rest of someone's natural life, right? If I promise to give you bar exam or law school lectures for the rest of my natural life, is it possible that we can perform that contract in less than 365 days? Yeah, I could die tomorrow, right? And that would be performance in less than 365 days. So that does not trigger the statute of frauds. A person can die at any time. So that's always a trick, right? So anytime you see that on a contracts fact pattern, a promise to do something for the rest of someone's life, that's pretty much always a statute of frauds trick question, right? You should always be aware of that because anyone can die at any time, right? So that's not going to trigger the 1 year provision. The other one is likelihood of performance. Even if it seems highly unlikely that the performance can be performed in less than 1 year, but it is possible, then that's not going to trigger the statute of frauds. Remember, if it's at all possible that the performance can be completed before 365 days, then it does not trigger the statute of frauds. So imagine here that I promise to build you an exact replica of the Egyptian pyramids, right? Well, by its terms, right, and say there's no time term in there. I just say, I promise to build you an exact replica of the Egyptian pyramids, right? Well, that seems unlikely that I'm going to perform that in less than a year. It seems like a massive task. How can anyone perform that in less than a year? But it is theoretically possible, right? I could hire a 2,000 person construction crew, something massive, and we could get it done. It is possible, right? So because it's possible, even though unlikely, we say that that does not trigger the statute of frauds. So really, to trigger the statute of frauds under the 1 year provision, like I said, there has to be some sort of time requirement, like a length of time is stated in the contract, right? Like a 13-month lease, right? That's impossible to be completed in less than a year. Or an 8-month lease if it starts 6 months from the date of formation, right? So, but you have to basically have that time requirement because anything could, right, happen. A person can die tomorrow. A replica of the entire state building can be built in a short amount of time, right? A replica of the Egyptian pyramids can be built in a short amount of time, in less than a year. All these things are possible, even though unlikely, right? So all of those are the tricks to look out for the 1 year provision. So really what you're looking for there, again, you want to see that time requirement of more than 1 year. Without that, even if it seems unlikely, doesn't matter, okay? UCC Goods contracts of $500 or more, right? Very straightforward. Any purchase or sale of a good for $500 or more is going to trigger the statute of frauds. Really no tricks there, right? And the number is $500, right? Some places you'll see that the number is $5,000. For your purposes on the bar exam and law school final exams, unless you are told otherwise, the number is $500. So any contract for the purchase or sale of goods for $500 or more will trigger the statute of frauds. Okay, suretyship contracts. A suretyship contract is relatively straightforward. This is where a person is promising to pay the debt of another. We're going to have 3 parties typically involved in this type of contract, right? You have a surety who is making a promise to an obligee or a creditor to cover the principal debtor's debt, right? Typically you see this amongst family members, right? A family member is applying for some type of loan or college tuition or mortgage, whatever it is, right? Classically, you would see this in lease agreements too, right? Where a family member wants to help another family member get some sort of line of credit, or so to do this, they offer to the obligee or the creditor to cover their family member, the principal debtor's debt, right? For example, say that my niece is graduating from high school and she's going off to college, and as an 18-year-old, she doesn't have any type of line of credit really, or doesn't have a credit score at all really, or way to pay for that apartment, doesn't have any income coming in, but I want her to have a nice apartment to live in. So I tell the apartment complex, me, the surety, I make a promise to the apartment complex, the obligee or creditor, that I'm going to cover my niece's rent, right? If she, for any reason is unable to pay her rent on time, I am guaranteeing her debt. I will cover it, right? So I'm making a promise to the apartment complex. Me, the surety, is making a promise to the obligee or creditor, which is the apartment complex, to cover my niece's debt, right? The principal debtor, right? If she's unable to pay rent. Now, we do have, so if we have that type of contract, right, a suretyship contract, right, that's going to trigger the statute of frauds. The court needs to see evidence that that contract existed in order to enforce it. Now, the main exception we have here is what's called the main purpose exception. If the main purpose that the surety is entering the contract is for his own economic benefit, then it does not trigger the statute of frauds, right? That's not going to trigger the statute of frauds. We don't need to see evidence that that contract existed, right? Because remember, the main idea of the suretyship contract is usually amongst family members. It's a form of gratuity, right? You're doing it to help someone else out usually. But if you are actually doing this for your own economic benefit, then we're going to say that's an exception to this suretyship contract that will trigger the statute of frauds, right? So imagine here that if the main purpose I am guaranteeing my niece's debt to the apartment complex is because I want to use that apartment as another office and I'm going to work my niece 14 hours a day, reading case books or whatever, doing research for Studicata, then the main reason that I'm entering into that suretyship contract is for my own economic benefit. That is not going to trigger the statute of frauds, right? It's important to recognize main purpose exception. Executor, administrator of an estate, right? This is really just a different form of a suretyship contract, right? If the executor or administrator of an estate promises to cover the debt owed by the estate to creditors out of his own personal money, then that is going to trigger the statute of frauds, right? Again, here the estate owes debt, right? So if a person dies and that person, when you die, your creditors are the first in line to get money from the estate, right? Before that estate's going to pay out family members or anyone else, the estate has to cover the debts owed by the decedent. But the executor or administrator could come along and promise the creditors to pay off the decedent's debt or the estate's debt out of his own pocket. If he does that, right, that's basically a different form of a suretyship agreement, right? But that also does trigger the statute of frauds. There, the executor would be the surety, the creditors would be the obligee, right? And the principal would basically be the estate. It's just another form of a suretyship contract. Notably, very unlikely you're going to see executors and administrators of an estate on a contract law fact pattern because wills, trusts, and estates are governed by an entirely separate law, right? An entirely separate field of law. Unlikely you would see that kind of crossover between contracts and wills, trusts, and estates, but worth noting, right? So also the last one we have that's going to trigger the statute of frauds are real estate contracts, right? And what we're really saying here is TRC, right? Transfer, receive, or create. Any agreement or promise to transfer, receive, or create an interest in real estate is going to trigger the statute of frauds. So notably that includes mortgages, right? Mortgages, you're creating an interest in real property. That's going to trigger the statute of frauds. What about leases of land and easements, right? If you haven't taken real property yet, easements are basically a form of leasing land, right? Basically what you're doing there is getting permission to use somebody's land, usually a portion of somebody's land for some purpose, for, as an established amount of time. For our purposes though, don't worry too much about what an easement actually is. You get there in real property. Just know that for leases of land and easements, when we're thinking about the statute of frauds, it's really not going to constitute a real estate contract as much as we're thinking about the 1 year provision. Even though these are types of real estate contracts, the real question is going to be, can this be performed in less than a year? If so, it does not trigger the statute of frauds. If it cannot, by its terms, be performed in less than a year, either the lease or easement, then it will trigger the statute of frauds, right? And then the last one you want to look out for here is kind of can be a trick, are construction projects. Say you're commissioning someone to build a building on a piece of land, right? The commissioning of hiring somebody to actually build the project does not itself trigger the statute of frauds, right? You're not transferring, receiving, or creating an interest in real property. You're just building something on top of it. That construction project itself is not going to trigger the statute of frauds. Now, if by its terms, it's a 3-year construction project, right, that could still be triggered under the 1 year provision, right? So if it's a construction project to build a skyscraper on some piece of land, and by its terms it says the construction project is going to take 3 years to complete, right? It could still trigger the statute of frauds, but it won't be under the real estate section. It's going to be under the 1 year provision, right? Real estate, we're really only talking about transferring, receiving, or creating an interest in real property, not construction projects in of themselves, right? So here, that again, M.O.U.S.E.R, right? M-O-U-S-E-R are all the ways that the statute of frauds can be triggered. So Anytime on a contract law fact pattern that you see a contract, right, made in consideration of marriage or cannot be performed by its terms and under a year from the date of formation, or you have a UCC Goods contract for $500 or more, Suretyship contract, Executor, Administrator of an Estate, Suretyship contract, or a real estate interest being transferred, received, or created. You see any fact pattern with any of these happening, right? You have to immediately think statute of frauds, right? Does this satisfy the statute of frauds? Because we know if the contract falls under any of these categories, that triggers the statute of frauds. If so, we have to move on to step number 2, which is whether the statute of frauds is actually satisfied. Once it's triggered, in order to enforce that contract in court, remember, the court has to see evidence that the contract existed. We call that satisfying the statute of frauds, right? And really, there's 2 ways that we can satisfy the statute of frauds. We have writing and perform. Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first-year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying, and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career, and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.